Welcome to the Airline Pilot Podcast. I'm Jason Ambrosi. As a pilot, you're well acquainted with communicating through problems and high-stress situations on the flight deck. But that training doesn't always apply to life here on the ground. In those cases, we call on the help of people like Naseem Khuri, who wear many hats and titles, including adjunct assistant professor of international negotiations at Tufts University. His expertise in negotiations, influence, and conflict management would benefit every one of our members. Naseem, thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. I started off in college. I was interested in helping people and following the footsteps of my dad, who was this great heart surgeon. So I was a pre-med student. I thought I wanted to be a doctor, help people that way. Realized at the end of senior year, after spending 4 years in the lab and having no life, that I really wasn't into the science. I was interested in one aspect of it, which was immunology, which is basically how the body has conflicts with itself. And then I realized I was actually interested in conflict outside the body. So found this strange, weird field of conflict management and worked my way through some organizations that focus on that and have been a consultant working with different types of organizations ever since. So I work with all sorts, from special operators in the military to Israeli-Palestinian diplomats to pilots, obviously, to eighth graders, to grad students. And I find that with all of those different contexts, and they're very different contexts, different languages, very similar human dynamics at play here. And so I'm fascinated by those dynamics. I love the sort of diversity of all those different types of people. And so this was the job for me.
Well, that's great. Not many people can say they love what they do, right? We're pilots, and I can tell you that our pilots love doing what they do every day. So it's good to meet somebody else that actually that really loves what they do and aren't just punching the clocks. Well, now that we know where you've been, can you tell us what you're doing here with us this week?
Sure.
And what conversations are you having with our pilots?
Absolutely. I love working with pilots because there's this strange dynamic where I'm sitting here talking about how we collaborate with each other and how we influence each other and how we can work well together. And that might mean me asking you a bunch of questions and us building relationship and doing all these wonderful things. But on the flight deck, you don't want that, right? You have precious seconds and minutes to make decisions. There needs to be a clear line of authority. And as you said, sometimes, when you're on the ground, those lines of authority aren't quite there. So I'm simply introducing why is it hard to influence? Why is it hard to collaborate when those lines of authority aren't there? When you don't have authority over someone, you just got to get them to come along with you. How do you do that? And why is that hard? And so I'm sort of trying with the pilots to introduce a few challenges to that. And what are the kind of traps that we tend to fall into? And then introduce a few tools to say, well, look, here's how you might be able to deal with those situations a little bit better. And again, you're making the distinction between what you're doing on the ground and then in the flight deck. I don't want you bringing in my stuff in the flight deck. I want the clear line of control on the flight deck. So those are the types of conversations that we're having. And I think that you all taking seriously this idea that, there's a certain skill set that you need for certain situations is really important, right? I want to be able to help pilots hone their skill set on those tough conversations that they're having when there's no clear line of authority. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's essential to what our reps who are here this week have to learn to do their job effectively, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what this is all about.
Yeah.
Here at ALPA, we represent more than 79,000 pilots at 42 airlines. As a result, number one, we always have some group or groups in negotiations. And two, we've seen the full range of the process from long and hostile to friendly and quick. So what advice would you give groups who know they're about to engage in negotiations with management who are known to be intransigent?
First, I would ask, have you done your homework? Have you figured out not just what you want, but why you want it? I spend most of my time with my clients pushing them on why they want what they're asking for, right? We tend to go into negotiations preparing our positions, right? And we try to look for data that backs up our positions. And if we don't get that position that we've been asking for, we consider it a failure. We judge our metrics of success is whether we get that position or not. And I just see over and over again that when we set that as our metric, we're disappointed. We don't get that position exactly as we want it. And so it's a real question of figuring out, well, what do I actually care about? What's leading to that position? What are the interests behind that position?
Mm-hmm.
What do I actually care about? What are my core motivating factors? And can I problem solve for that instead of problem solving for the position? So I would ask, have I figured out what we're actually doing and why we're doing it? So yeah, I worked with a military client just a few years ago. I'm not going to mention which branch of the military, but they were trying to advocate on the Hill in Washington, and they had a very strong policy recommendation. They had a very strong approach, a strong position. And I asked this question, why? And then they gave me an answer. And then I asked the question, why again? And they had no answer. They're like, I don't know. I guess that's just what we want, right? So I always encourage people to channel my 5-year-old son when he just asks that question, why, over and over, without the annoyingness, but channel that to figure out what the core concerns are and then problem solve for that. So that's the first thing I do. And then the second thing I do is I would ask, have we checked our own assumptions? I would ask like, okay, if we think they're being intransigent, why is that? Are they? Are they just doing the same thing that we just talked about, where they're just operating from their position, and if they don't get their position, they're going to sort of act badly? But is there a way we can problem solve for that too? Is there a way we can steer them in the process to have a better conversation around that and not just react to these positions, but maybe do better problem solving, figuring out what the core motivating factors are? We often think that someone who's being intransigent or just being unreasonable or things like that, in their minds, they're not at all, right?
Yes.
In their minds, they're being completely rational, and they're looking at all the data in front of them, and they're coming to a very rational conclusion. And it's us who are the crazy ones. So can we break down that sort of barrier and try to operate, be like, all right, how do we sort of go along with this together and figure out what the problem that you really need solved is? And I'll let you know what my problem being solved is. Yeah. I don't know. Did I answer your question?
Yes. Just to piggyback on it, I couldn't agree more. As the why is important, because sometimes the positions are going to be very different with the company, the management team. But I think sometimes in a personal experience doing this, you sit there and say, okay, this is why this is so important to our members. This is why the pilots feel this way, and try to explain it to them and say that's why we're here. And then it's almost like humanizing the position, right? You're saying, look, this is what these pilots feel. This is what scope. When you give this flying to another foreign airline instead of ours, and they're flying into our hubs, this is what that visceral feel is to us. It's not just numbers. Mm-hmm. And then it kind of humanizes it, and they see your position, and then, okay, maybe it's more, all right, we understand where you're going now. Okay.
Right.
It's not just X's and O's and so on. And that's essential on both sides.
It's rarely about the numbers, right? I mean, we look at NBA players and they complain about a millions and millions of dollar contract, and you're saying, how could you possibly complain about that millions of dollars? And they're like, it's not about the money at all. It's about fairness. He's looking at the other players around the league. It's about dignity. It's about these kind of sort of core issues, right?
Right, for sure.
So how do you solve for that? That's always my problem. Like, can you solve for those problems and not the main position? If you could solve for the position, we wouldn't even be having this conversation, right? They'd say yes, and we go on our way. But that's clearly not the case, right? We have to be able to get more creative and look at those deep motivating factors and then be creative in how we solve for them.
So looking at some other areas of your expertise, how does influence and conflict management intersect with achieving that contract we just talked about?
Yeah. I think that a lot of times, first off, we need to align on what fair even means, right? Mm-hmm. So do we have the right definition of fair? Do we have it amongst ourselves? Do we know what we're saying ourselves? And then what does fair mean to the other side too? But sometimes we have generational disputes within a union. The older folks think something very differently than the younger folks, as you know well.
Yes.
And so do we align on what fair means there? But overall, I think that these principles that I'm talking about with influence, with conflict management, all I'm basically saying is that, can you get the person to sort of come along with you on this process? Can you get them to care about your problem so that they can help you solve it? And the way that you might be able to do that is by caring about their problem too and helping them solve their problem. That to me is the factor. And that's oftentimes what I go into with negotiations. I'm not going in with a necessary I need to hit this number and this policy. And I've got some sort of solution in my brain, but it doesn't have to be the solution. And I'm not going to set my success on it. My main sort of barometer is, I want them to come along with me. And that might take us to really interesting places. And I might need to influence them on certain aspects of that. But the real challenge is going to be like, how can I recruit you to be a partner in solving my problem with me? How do we do this thing together?
Right.
And again, we might end up somewhere completely, like wildly different. There's a story in our world, a colleague of ours who spent law school in the back of the classroom playing chess with his buddy, not paying attention. And he would consistently lose to his friend. And his friend turned out to be this internationally ranked grandmaster of chess, whatever they called. And our buddy John went to him one day and said, look, you keep beating me. Why is that? And the chess master said, John, look, you are a great player. When you see a great move, you take it. He said, yeah, what's the problem with that? And he said, when I see a great move, I put it aside and I look for a better move. And I put that aside and I look for a better move. And I usually end up going with my 8th or 9th move. And that's how I want us to think about problem solving here too. Because we're very quick to say like, it's either this solution or nothing. Or have we built the processes where we can actually use those interests and get to that 8th or 9th solution? Or are we just reacting to the first or the second, right? Are we a good chess player or are we great? And can we look at those options in that certain way? So I want us sort of getting creativity is a huge part of the game here, I think, as well.
Yeah, I echo that. In our last contract negotiations, we had such a great negotiating team, and we'd get the company to tell us, what problem are you trying to solve? And partner and say, hey, what can we do? Our people are smart. We're the people out there are doing this every day. Our negotiating team would get down and say, okay, what problem are you trying to solve? And let us try to see if we can find a better way that's even more efficient to solve this problem.
Nice.
And sometimes it's very difficult to get the company to say, we know, just like you said, we know. We've got smart people. We don't need your help. And then over time, you educate and say, look, we're the ones out there doing it every day. Let us get involved and help. So,
can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
How do they react when you say we're the ones doing it every day? Because I could imagine that they might be like, oh, fine, you guys are the experts, but we got our expertise too.
Well, there's a reason it takes years to get a contract sometimes, right? Not because we're all get down and we all agree for sure. So it's tough, and a lot of credit goes to the negotiators that are in there dealing with that every day. You go over there and you sit across from the company representatives that, by and large, nope, this is how we do it. We're not going to do it any different. This is our proposal. So it's just time and getting there and trying to get to some other person in the company to say, hey, your team is being intransigent. We need you to shake this loose and consider these other things. And that's why it takes years, right? That it shouldn't. You would think that, someday we'll get to a point where we show up and the company gives their, not best and final, but something closer, and we do the same and say, okay, we're only this far apart. Let's just hash this out.
Yeah.
That day may never come, right? Because it just, for some reason, everybody moves 1/10 of an inch on every proposal, and it takes a long time to get where you need to go. So.
And you spend so much time internally coming up with the position that it feels like any movement off of it feels like a loss and feels like concession and feels like...
And the pilots are so invested, the elected reps, the MEC members are so invested in the process that they feel like they're almost at the table because it's we live this stuff, right? It's so important to make sure we do a good job for our members. And anytime you don't get what you want or everything, you feel like it's a loss. But the whole saying, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. I'm proud of the work that we've done as ALPA to raise the tide for everybody in the last several years post-COVID. But
totally.
Anyway, you're not interviewing me. I'm interviewing you. So
that's
good. No, that's good.
But, I ask a lot of questions.
What would you say to one of our members who says they're maybe disenfranchised? They decline to vote in an election. They don't speak up about what's important to them. They're discouraged by the process or because they're one of thousands at an airline that they feel like their say doesn't matter.
Yeah. Probably wouldn't say a thing at first. Probably would listen. Would ask them a bunch of questions. Why are you feeling this way? How'd you get here? What's this looking like? If you feel excluded from the process, then maybe we need to also do some soul searching internally. Say, what is it about our processes that have led to this, right? It could be that this person is feeling this way because of certain interactions they've had. It could also be that the structure sort of creates that dynamic. And then maybe we need to look internally and say, well, are our structures properly? Are there enough touch points with this person? Is this person in the loop enough? Are we setting the right kind of dynamic for this person and the right vibe? I worked in another context in labor management issues, and it was a similar, they had contract negotiations every 3 years, and they had the contract negotiations the same exact way, which were in the same hotel and really long rectangular table, and the management would come in first, and they would come in single file, and they would turn at the same time and sit at the same time. And then the union would come in single file and turn at the same time, sit at the same time, and then they'd throw a binder across the table and say, all right, let's get started. But even before a word was said, the tone was set, right?
Yeah.
Such a clear tone of adversarial, competitive, etc. And so if I could be in the room, I'd say, timeout. What's the tone that you just created right now? Just with the setup and the process and the structure of how you're having this meeting. And I might say with this guy, the same thing. Like, what are those structures? And are the structures that we're having this engagement with this person leading to a certain set of behaviors and thoughts that we wouldn't like? I would want to take a look at our structures and what kind of meetings are we having with them? And should they be in a different place? Should we be meeting more often? Should the different people be in the room? What kind of structures can we change to be able to lead to a possibly different outcome? And it could be that we just try to influence him directly, but if he's still operating within structures that continue to create resentment or feeling excluded, then you're putting a little bit of a Band-Aid on a deeper problem, right? So yeah, I always encourage people to sort of look at those structures, right?
Okay, that's good advice. As a conflict resolution expert, you're in the business of trying to avoid long battles, of course, but that's not always the case. Is there ever a time when it's warranted?
Sure, definitely. I will never say you should always negotiate, or you should always come to the table, or you should always even have a hard conversation. There are certain factors that would lead you to one way or the other, but the one thing I would say you always should do is just be deliberate and thoughtful. That's it, not reactive. So that said, there are absolutely times when it's not appropriate to negotiate, when it's not appropriate to be talking. There might be a power imbalance. You might need to step away from the table and try to build power internally. Do more work with alignment with your side before you come back to the table. There might need to be all sorts of moves like that you take. A colleague of mine wrote a cool book called When to Talk and When to Fight. And it just sort of establishes some criteria. When is it appropriate to actually get to the table? And my question is always, all right, you spent a lot of time being able to be away from the table, building your power, getting the conditions right, etc. Then when you actually come to the table, are you ready? Do you have those skill sets? Because those are very different skills, to be able to be away from the table, building power, rallying up your crew, whatever it is, and then being at the table itself and being able to actually, again, build a collaborative environment and have them come along with you and all that kind of stuff. So I really think it depends on that power asymmetry, and then being able to do that dance between being away from the table and at the table and away and at and things like that.
Putting the right people in the right positions. Because like you said, they're very different.
Absolutely.
Very different.
Absolutely.
You've got quite a list of prior clients, including Israel, Palestine, international diplomats, political leaders, you said the Navy SEALs, DOD, Fortune 100 companies. Was there any surprises working with some of them? So there's a story away from pilots that might be something interesting from these high-profile groups that you can tell us anyway.
Yeah. I think what always surprises me is how we never seem to realize how predictable people are, right? I keep going back to what they teach us in kindergarten, right? Treat others the way you want to be treated. And people always seem to forget that. We're surprised when we come at someone with some heat and they react defensively and they don't just capitulate and they don't just say like, oh, yeah, great point, I'll come along with you, right? That doesn't happen. And we're always surprised when that doesn't happen because we think our arguments are so great. And if I just passionately say this thing. So I guess I'm always surprised at how predictable we all are. Of course, they're going to get upset if you just denied them autonomy, if you excluded them from this process. Like there's certain things that I'm just constantly thinking like, if that happened to me, yeah, I'd be pretty pissed off too. So that's one thing that always surprises me, whether it's in like, again, a special operator setting or whether it's working with Israelis and Palestinians or whoever it is. Humans are humans. And that, I keep going back to that lesson from kindergarten.
That makes a lot of sense, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you bring the heat.
Yeah.
You got to expect a response.
Yeah.
So
There's always
there's
gonna be
times
a
for that,
response.
right? Of course, there's times for that. Especially in our world, we see that with whether it's special interests trying to water back our safety requirements and the things we fought hard for, or it's companies that aren't recognizing the value of the pilots as their true stakeholders and not giving them the contract that they've earned. But yeah, that makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. If there was one thing that you wish everyone in the world understood about conflict management, negotiating, influence, just one main takeaway for our listeners, what would it be?
It's a skill, and we need to treat it like a skill. I really treat our ability to manage relationships, our ability to, in the moment, not react, our ability to ask questions, all of those are defined skills that we just won't improve if we don't practice. Simple as that. I would love if everyone treated just the ability to ask good questions and get down to the core idea of what is actually driving someone. I would love if someone treated that no differently than shooting free throws on a basketball court, right? When I go to practice basketball, I shoot free throws, I shoot 100 free throws, and I practice and I get better. Why can't we do the same with asking questions, getting to the root cause of what's driving someone, right? Now, when I say that, people hate me because I'm giving them homework.
Right.
And I'm saying, like, you're already precious time. I'm taking it up with, sitting there weirdly asking questions, like at home with my spouse. Like, what am I supposed to do? And my answer is always like, yeah, if you want to improve, you got to practice. And you have to be deliberate around how you practice. And you have to figure out what exactly you're working on and how to practice. And those are the kind of skills that I want to sort of bring out in people like, oh, wait, I really don't do a good job. I ask one question, but then I immediately advocate when I hear the answer. But do I actually really know what's motivating them? Like, no, I need to ask like 6 questions to get down to what's motivating them. Or have I shown them that I feel like they've been heard, right?
Right.
I can point to any conflict in the world and show you a population of people who have not been heard. And how do I do a good job in the moment of acknowledging what I just heard? Doesn't mean I agree with them, but just simply showing that, yeah, I hear you. And if I were in your position, I'd probably have the same idea too. But that's a skill. And being able to not react in the moment or just fall back on default behaviors that we've spent our entire lives cultivating. It's like if I ask you to fold your arms, you do it one way. And then I ask you to fold it the other way. You're like, wait, that feels weird. That feels totally strange. If I ask you to brush your teeth with the other hand tonight, it feels totally weird.
Right.
A lot of times I'm asking people to do that because the work that is required to see improvement in negotiations or influence conversations or just managing conflict when the guy's being a jerk require a little bit of discomfort, just like tweaking your shot on the basketball court, right? But if we don't treat it as a skill, we just won't get better. And
Yeah, that makes sense. So I've noticed in tough conversations, whether it's with senior management officials or government officials, if you take that approach of active listening and trying to relate, I try to put myself in your shoes. I try to see what it looks like through your eyes so that I can relay what's here. And then if they think that you actually are listening to them and that, for lack of a better term, you give a crap about what they think and what you're there and you're not just being transactional, it seems to break down those barriers and make the conversation more productive.
And you're doing it genuinely, not in a way to manipulate them. And it feels legit, like you're genuinely concerned about them, because I feel like you and I are going to come to a better resolution if I know what you care about and if you know what I care about, right? So yeah, it's very much a skill. And that's why I'm excited when ALPA prioritizes this, when they see the value in it. I'm excited when our special operators in the naval special warfare or wherever else see the value in that. I'm excited when I get to work with people because they're showing like, it is something that we can always improve on and we can actually get better results and we can manage relationships while also advancing what we want. And we don't have to sort of have that tension of managing a relationship while trying to get what we want. We can do both of those things if we can just, get better at it over time.
For sure. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining us today, Naseem. Yeah, any tool that we can use to amplify our voice as pilots and bring their perspectives to the front of a conversation is critical. And I think what you've given us today will help that. And thank you for briefing our new representatives on this key piece to make them more effective in their jobs. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Airline Pilot Podcast. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. And if you enjoyed this episode, let your fellow crew members know about the show. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, reach out to podcast@alpa.org. To listen and subscribe to the Airline Pilot Podcast or learn more about ALPA, check us out online at alpa.org or find us on all major podcast platforms. Until next time, this is the Airline Pilot Podcast. Production, copyright ALPA 2025. All rights reserved. Thanks and have a safe flight.